The lecture hall buzzed with excited chatter as Professor Veldar announced the day's exercise. The Krillion's 4 eyes gleamed with what could only be described as academic mischief as he addressed the galactic xenobiology class. Today, we will conduct an informal poll, the professor announced, his mandibles clicking with amusement. Based on your studies this semester, you will vote on which species you believe to be the most dangerous in known space. The classroom erupted. Students from dozens of worlds leaned toward each other, debating in hushed, urgent tones. The massive Thracker sitting in the back row flexed his 4 arms confidently, certain his species would dominate. The hive-minded Zixtar collective whispered among themselves in perfect synchronization. Even the usually stoic Saurian delegates seemed engaged, their scales rippling with competitive interest. Dangerous by what metric? Called out a sharp-voiced Avarian from the middle rows, her feathers ruffling. You decide, Professor Veldar replied. Combat capability, survival instincts, strategic thinking, adaptability, whatever criteria you deem most relevant. This is, after all, a subjective exercise designed to examine our biases. The discussion intensified. Names were thrown around with varying degrees of seriousness. The Krell dominators with their biological weapons and hive warfare. The void wraiths who could survive in hard vacuum and metabolized radiation. The ancient progenitors, though extinct, who had seeded half the galaxy with engineered life. In the back corner, a human sat quietly, stylus hovering over his data pad. His name was David, and he'd been attending the Galactic Academy for 3 months now. He was unremarkable by most standards, average height, average build, brown hair kept shorter than human fashion typically preferred. He wore the standard student jumpsuit and kept to himself. Most of the class had forgotten he was there. Let's make this interesting, Professor Veldar continued. Anonymous voting. Submit your choice and a brief justification. We'll tally the results and discuss. Data pads flickered throughout the room as students entered their selections. David hesitated, then typed, humans. His justification was simple. We don't know when to quit. The results appeared on the main display within moments. The Thracker Imperium led with 37% of the vote. Their reputation as warriors was well-earned, 8 feet of muscle, redundant organs, and a culture built entirely around martial prowess. The Krell followed at 23%, then a smattering of other species, each claiming single-digit percentages. Humans appeared on the list with exactly 1 vote, 0.4%. Laughter rippled through the classroom. A Thracker named Gorath twisted in his seat, his yellow eyes scanning the room. Who voted for the humans? He called out, his voice rumbling like grinding stone. Was it you, Softskin? He'd spotted David. David didn't respond. He simply met Gorath's gaze for a moment, his expression neutral, then looked back down at his notes. Fascinating, Professor Veldar interjected, manipulating the display to highlight the human entry. Let's examine this outlier. The justification states, we don't know when to quit. Can anyone elaborate on what might make humanity dangerous? Silence. A few students exchanged uncertain glances. They're new to the galactic stage, someone offered. Barely 100 years since first contact. They have primitive kinetic weapons and slow ships. Their homeworld is a death world, yes, but they're not apex predators there. They're pursuit predators at best. Endurance hunters, corrected a Saurian. They're persistent, I'll grant them that. But dangerous. That's hyperbolic. Gorath laughed, a sound like boulders colliding. I could break one with my smallest arm. David's stylus stopped moving. For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Not anger, not fear, but something older and colder. Then it was gone, replaced by the same quiet expression he always wore. Professor Veldar noticed. His specialized eyes, evolved to detect the slightest predatory movements, caught that micro-expression. Interesting, he murmured, too softly for most to hear. Very interesting indeed. The discussion moved on, but the professor's gaze lingered on the human in the back corner, and a question began forming in his complex mind. Who exactly was this quiet student, And what did he know that his classmates didn't? David had been on the Galactic Academy station for 93 days. He'd submitted his application through the Human Integration Program, a diplomatic initiative designed to spread humanity's presence across the wider galaxy. The application had asked about education, skills, and career goals. It hadn't asked about military service. He'd listed his degrees, xenobiology and comparative anatomy, both earned through the Veterans Education Assistance Program after his discharge. He'd listed his work experience, 3 years as a wildlife researcher on New Tanzania, studying the adaptation patterns of Earth-origin species on colony worlds. He'd even listed his hobbies: reading, distance running, and tactical games. What he hadn't listed were the 8 years before that. The years spent in places whose names were still classified, doing things that would remain redacted in official records for another 40 years. The Human Coalition Navy had stamped honorable discharge on his papers and given him a handshake and a pension, and that was supposed to be the end of it. He'd been fine with that arrangement. David had seen enough action to last several lifetimes. He'd done his part in the Sol Unification Wars, then in the ugly little brushfire conflicts that erupted as humanity expanded beyond its home system. He'd earned his scars, the ones visible on his body and the ones that woke him up at 0300 hours in a cold sweat, reaching for weapons that weren't there. The academy had seemed like a perfect escape. Study alien life, pursue a peaceful career, maybe join a research expedition to catalog extremophiles on some distant world. Keep his head down, do the work, and leave the violence behind. But violence, David had learned, has a way of finding you. The problem started small. On his second week, a Thacker student named Gorath had accidentally knocked David's meal tray across the cafeteria. Testing boundaries, David recognized. It was the same behavior he'd seen in basic training, in unit integration, in every hierarchical group that ever existed. Someone would push, see how you responded, establish dominance. David had simply gotten a new tray and sat elsewhere. No confrontation, no escalation. But Gorath had interpreted that as weakness. The incidents escalated, jostling in corridors, jokes about human fragility, small acts of disrespect calculated to provoke a response. Other students began to follow Gorath's lead. Nothing overt enough to report to station authorities, but a steady drumbeat of low-level harassment. David endured it. He'd endured worse. Boot camp instructors, hostile locals on pacification missions, interrogators during SEER training. Compared to that, some oversized students playing dominance games barely registered. He just wanted to finish his degree. His classmates mistook his patience for timidity. His refusal to engage was read as inability rather than choice. The quiet human who ran the station's track at odd hours, who studied alone in corners of the library, who spoke rarely and always politely. He became the class's unofficial punching bag. Professor Veldar noticed, of course. His species had survived predation by being extraordinarily observant, and he saw things others missed. He saw how David moved with economy and precision, wasting no motion. He saw how the human's eyes were always scanning, tracking threats and exits even in casual settings. He saw the deliberate control in every gesture. These were not the behaviors of prey. After one particularly pointed incident, Gorath had playfully seized David's shoulder with enough force to bruise most species. The professor had called David to his office. "You served in your species' military," Veldar stated. Not a question. David had hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir. But I'm a student now. That's behind me." "Is it?" The professor's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. "You carry yourself like a warrior, David. Not like a soldier in active service, but like one who has seen combat and survived it. My species has a saying, 'The predator who pretends to be prey invites true predators.'" "I'm not pretending to be anything," David replied carefully. "I'm just trying to study xenobiology and not cause problems. And yet problems find you." Veldar had pulled up incident reports on his display. 17 documented accidental conflicts in 2 months. You filed no complaints. "They're just kids, sir. Flexing, testing boundaries. It's harmless." "Is it?" Veldar's eyes fixed on David with uncomfortable intensity. Some of these kids are trained warriors from cultures that value combat prowess above all else. They're reading your restraint as weakness. One day, one of them will push too far and then he'd let the sentence hang. David had simply nodded. I'll be careful, sir. But careful wasn't always enough. 3 weeks later came the vote on most dangerous species, and Gorath's mockery in front of the entire class. The Thracker's yellow eyes gleaming with contempt, his voice booming. I could break one with my smallest arm. And David, remembering things he tried very hard to forget, had felt something cold and familiar stir in his chest. The part of him that had survived ambushes and close-quarters combat, the part trained by experts to turn the human body into a weapon, the part that had learned to do terrible things efficiently and without hesitation. He'd pushed it down, locked it away again. But Professor Veldar had seen the micro-expression. And somewhere in the professor's complex mind, an alarm had begun to sound. The week following the vote, the classroom dynamics shifted. What had been casual harassment took on a sharper edge. Gorath, emboldened by the laughter his comment had earned, began organizing what he called demonstrations of Thacker superiority. During practical exercises in the combat simulation lab, ostensibly for studying predator-prey dynamics, Gorath volunteered repeatedly to face David. The simulations were supposedly controlled, weapons set to non-lethal training modes, but everyone knew accidents happened. A Thracker's strength advantage meant even a training strike could break human bones. David declined each challenge politely. I'm here to study, not compete, he said. The Avarian student, Kreshtar, tilted her head curiously. Are all humans so averse to proving themselves? On my world, we settle disputes through aerial combat demonstrations. It's considered healthy. Different cultures, David replied neutrally. Humans have a saying, the best fight is the one you don't have. Sounds like coward's wisdom, Gorath rumbled, and several students chittered their agreement. Even some of the more sympathetic classmates began to wonder. A Saurian named Trex, yes, his species found the nominal coincidence hilarious, approached David in the library one evening. I mean no offense, the Saurian began, his scales shifting to placating yellow-green. But your species' reputation suggests greater assertiveness. The human delegation that negotiated first contact was formidable. Your merchants drive hard bargains. Yet you, he trailed off delicately. Yet I don't fit the stereotype? David finished. He closed his textbook on Krillian neural architecture and looked up. My people have a lot of faces, Trex. Not all of us are diplomats or merchants. What were you? Before you were a student? The question hung in the air. David considered his answer carefully. I worked in wildlife management, he said finally. It wasn't technically a lie. The Navy had called it hostile environment pacification, but it amounted to the same thing, dealing with dangerous creatures in their natural habitats. Trex nodded, apparently satisfied, but David could see the doubt in his eyes. The whole class doubted him now. Even Professor Veldar seemed uncertain, watching David with an intensity that felt like being studied under a microscope. The professor began incorporating more challenging scenarios into their practical work. Group exercises in the wilderness simulation chambers, where students had to work together to survive hostile environments. Problem-solving scenarios that tested combat tactics disguised as predator analysis. David performed adequately, never poorly enough to fail, never well enough to stand out. He helped his team when asked, followed instructions, and kept his knowledge carefully compartmentalized. When a Krell student asked how to set up a defensive perimeter against simulated predators, David suggested basic positioning that any civilian might know from wilderness survival guides. But Veldar noticed what David didn't say. The human avoided mentioning overlapping fields of fire, fallback positions, or the dozen other tactical considerations a trained soldier would automatically include. He was deliberately underperforming. The professor's concern deepened. Was the human actually incompetent, hiding behind false modesty? Or was he hiding something more dangerous, genuine capability that, if revealed, might shift the entire classroom's power dynamic? Veldar decided to test his theory. During a lecture on interspecies conflict resolution, he posed a hypothetical scenario. Your research team is ambushed by hostile natives on an uncharted world. You're outnumbered 3-1. Your weapons are limited. Your escape route is blocked. What do? Hands shot up. The Thracker advocated direct assault, their species' solution to most problems. The Krell suggested chemical warfare. The Avarians proposed aerial bombardment. David, Veldar called. You've been quiet. What would humans do? All eyes turned to the back corner. David set down his stylus very carefully. Hope we packed good running shoes, he said lightly, and a few students laughed. I'm serious, Veldar pressed. Your species has a reputation for asymmetric warfare. How would humans approach such a scenario? David's expression remained neutral, but something flickered behind his eyes. A calculation, an assessment, a set of scenarios running through trained neural pathways. Humans would probably try to negotiate, he said finally. De-escalate. Find a peaceful solution. And if negotiation failed? Silence. David held the professor's gaze for a long moment. Then we'd adapt, he said quietly. Humans are good at adapting. Adapt how? Gorath challenged from his seat. You have no natural weapons. Your strength is pathetic. Your senses are mediocre. What exactly would you adapt? David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. We'd use what we had. Terrain, tools, tactics. We'd make noise if we needed to scare them off. We'd fight only if we had no choice. Tools and tactics, Gorath scoffed. This is why Thracker dominate. We don't need tricks. We have strength. Strength isn't everything, David said, and for the first time, there was an edge in his voice. Not anger, something colder. History is full of strong species that went extinct. Are you threatening me, Softskin? No. David's tone was perfectly level again. I'm stating an ecological fact. Overspecialization is an evolutionary liability. Dinosaurs were strong too. Trex hissed in amusement at that one, breaking the tension slightly. But Professor Veldar wasn't laughing. He'd heard something in David's voice, professional assessment, detached analysis, the tone of someone who'd studied violence not as theory but as craft. And he'd seen something in the human's eyes that confirmed his suspicions. This wasn't a frightened student tolerating bullies. This was a trained warrior exercising in human patience, a predator allowing prey animals to feel safe. And Veldar realized with growing alarm that his classroom was heading toward a demonstration none of them were prepared for. The only question was what would finally break David's carefully maintained control, and what would happen when it did. That answer came 2 days later, during what should have been a routine field exercise. The hostile environment survival practicum was supposed to be the semester's final exam. Teams of 4 students would be dropped into the station's wilderness simulation chamber, a massive dome that could replicate environments from across the galaxy, and given 72 hours to complete a series of objectives while avoiding simulated predators and environmental hazards. David's team consisted of himself, Trex the Saurian, a nervous Zixtar collective node named Unity of Purpose, and, to his profound lack of surprise, Gorath. The professor had done that deliberately, David knew, testing the dynamics, seeing if conflict would emerge under pressure. It was actually sound pedagogy, if potentially dangerous. Their assigned environment was a Category 4 death world simulation. High gravity, toxic vegetation, aggressive fauna, limited sightlines due to dense jungle canopy. The kind of place where evolution sharpened everything to a killing edge. Remember, Professor Veldar's voice crackled over their comm units as they materialized in the simulation. This is a learning exercise. Your suits will protect you from actual harm, but the simulation will feel entirely real. Pain receptors will register at 15% actual intensity, enough to teach caution without causing injury. Your objective is to reach the extraction point 40 kilometers northeast while collecting biological samples and surviving. You have 72 hours. Good luck. The jungle was immediately oppressive. Gravity pulled at them 1.3 times standard, and the air was thick with moisture and spores. David's suit filtered the atmosphere, but he could still smell the rich decay of the simulated environment. Spread out, Gorath ordered immediately, assuming command. We cover more ground that way. Bad idea, David said quietly. Splitting up in unknown hostile territory is. I wasn't asking your opinion, Softskin. Gorath's forearms flexed. Trex, you go west. Unity, take the south approach. David, try not to die going east. I'll take point north. Trex looked uncertain. Perhaps we should discuss strategy first? The professor emphasized teamwork. I am Thacker, Gorath interrupted, his chest plates expanding. We don't hide behind teams. We dominate environments. David bit back several responses. Arguing was pointless, and part of him was curious to see how this would play out. Okay, he said simply. See you at the extraction point. They separated. David moved through the jungle carefully, his training automatically cataloging details. The sound patterns, natural insect analogs versus predator movements. The sight lines and cover positions. The types of vegetation that could be used for shelter, for food, or for improvised tools. Within an hour, he'd collected 3 of his 5 required biological samples. Efficiently trapped insects, a soil culture, and a plant specimen. He marked the location on his suit's mapping system and began plotting the optimal route to extraction. That's when he heard the scream. Unity of purpose. The Zixtar's distress call was unmistakable. A high-pitched harmonic that transmitted terror across multiple frequencies. David's body reacted before his conscious mind registered it. Legs already moving, hand reaching for weapons that weren't there. He forced himself to slow, to think. The simulation had predators. Unity had probably triggered one. The Zixtar was small, not particularly combat-capable. Without help, the node would die in the simulation, not actually harmed, but failing the exercise and suffering the very real pain of simulated predation. David's comm crackled. Help! Something big. Too many teeth. I can't. Unity's voice cut off. Trex responded. I'm too far. 20 minutes at least. Gorath's voice came through. Bored. Natural selection in action. The weak fail. David was already running. The jungle canopy made straight-line navigation impossible, but he'd been tracking his position since insertion. Military habits died hard. He vaulted over a fallen log, ducked under low-hanging vines, splashed through a stream without slowing. 3 minutes later, he found Unity backed against a rock outcropping, a simulated predator circling. The creature was a nightmare of evolutionary efficiency. 4 meters of scaled muscle, 6 legs, and a mouth full of crystalline teeth. The simulation designers had based it on a real species from a planet humanity had charted during the expansion, one that had killed 3 members of the survey team. David recognized it instantly. He'd studied the after-action reports. Unity saw him arrive. David, help me, please. The predator's head swiveled, sensory organs locking onto new prey. It calculated instantly, smaller than current prey, but mobile, potentially more vulnerable. Pivoted with terrifying speed. David didn't run. He stopped, feet shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent, weight balanced. His hand moved to his belt and found the survival knife, the only weapon issued for the exercise, really just a tool for cutting vegetation and processing samples. The predator charged. What happened next took approximately 4.3 seconds but would be analyzed frame by frame in the simulation's recordings for months afterward. David didn't try to run or dodge. He stepped forward and slightly left, inside the creature's striking range. A move that violated every instinct prey species possessed. His left hand shot out and grabbed one of the predator's sensory stalks, yanking down and sideways while his body pivoted. The creature's momentum carried it forward even as David redirected its head, using the predator's own mass against it. As the creature stumbled, David's knife hand came up in a precise arc, edge-aligned, targeting the exact point where the skull met the spine on this species. The simulation registered a clean strike to the neural cluster. The predator collapsed, twitched once, and despawned, dead according to the simulation's rules. Unity stared, mouths agape. How did you? David was already moving, checking the area for additional threats, his breathing barely elevated. Are you hurt? He asked. And no, the suit protected me. But you just... That thing is a Class 5 predator. The briefing said avoid direct contact at all costs. The briefing was written for most species, David said absently, still scanning the perimeter. Humans have different options. He focused on unity. Can you walk? We need to move. Blood attracts scavengers, even simulated blood. They moved. Within 20 minutes, they'd rendezvoused with Trex, who stared at David with new eyes. Unity told me what you did, the Saurian said slowly. That was impressive. It was necessary, David replied. Gorath, what's your position? Static. Then, encountering some difficulty. Nothing I can't handle. But Gorath's voice carried a note David recognized. Someone in over their head, pride preventing them from admitting it. David pulled up the map. He's in the canyon sector. That's hunting ground for pack predators. Should we help him? Unity asked. After he abandoned me? David was already moving. Yes. Why? Trex asked, but he followed. He would leave you to die. Probably, David agreed. But I wouldn't leave him. Different standards. They found Gorath surrounded by 4 predators, smaller than the one David had killed, but pack hunters working with coordinated intelligence. The Thracker was holding them off with his natural strength, but he was bleeding from a dozen wounds, his movements slowing. Need a hand, David called out. Gorath's pride warred with survival instinct. Survival won. Yes, he growled. David assessed the situation in seconds. Trex, make noise, draw the left pair. Unity, your bait, run that direction, then double back. Gorath, when I move, you go right. You're giving ME orders? Gorath snarled. Yes, David said flatly, because I've done this before and you're about to die. Your choice. Gorath stared at the smaller human, seeing something he'd missed before. He nodded. They executed. Trex roared. An impressive sound that triggered the predator's territorial instincts. 2 broke off to investigate. Unity ran and 1 predator pursued, right into a trap where David had positioned himself behind a tree. The knife flashed once. The predator fell. The remaining predator, seeing its pack devastated in seconds, fled. Predators were smart that way, they knew when to disengage. The team stood in heavy silence. Gorath looked at David, really looked at him for the first time. You're not just a student, the Thracker said slowly. What are you? David's expression was unreadable. I'm a veteran, he said quietly. Human Coalition Navy. 8 years, multiple deployments. Discharged with honors. And I came here to study xenobiology and leave that life behind. He met Gorath's eyes. But you kept pushing. You could have told us, Trex said. Would you have listened? David asked. Or would you have just found new reasons to test me? No one answered. Come on, David said. We have an extraction point to reach and 20 hours to get there. We can discuss my service record when we're not in a hostile simulation. They moved as a team this time, with David naturally falling into point position, calling out threats, directing their path. And when they reached extraction with 6 hours to spare, having completed all objectives and lost 0 team members, Professor Veldar was waiting with an expression that managed to convey "I told you so" across the species divide. The lecture hall was packed the following week. Word had spread. The simulation recordings had leaked. Not officially, but station gossip traveled faster than light. Every student in the xenobiology program had seen the footage of the quiet human dispatching predators with clinical efficiency. Professor Veldar waited for the room to settle before speaking. Today's lesson concerns one of the most fundamental mistakes in xenobiology: assumption based on observation bias. He manipulated the display, showing various species. We look at the Thracker and see warriors. We observe Avarians and note aerial superiority. We catalog the Krell's chemical warfare capabilities. These are accurate observations. He paused. They are also incomplete. David sat in his usual seat, aware of every eye in the room. Let me tell you about humans, Veldar continued. They evolved as persistence hunters on a death world, that much you know. What you don't understand is what that actually means. Most predators on Earth are ambush hunters or pack hunters. Humans are neither. They are pursuit specialists. He pulled up a chart. Humans can run for hours, not fast but endlessly. They would wound prey and then follow it, literally walking after it, until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. This is why humans have exceptional endurance, advanced cooling systems, and the ability to track over vast distances. They don't give up. Gorath shifted uncomfortably in his seat. But Earth is also unusual in another way, the professor continued. It has relatively few apex predators compared to most habitable worlds. Know why? Because there's one omnivore that can eat nearly anything, can survive in almost any environment, and has the capacity to coordinate in massive groups. Humans didn't just survive on Earth. They dominated it so thoroughly that they drove dozens of larger, stronger predator species to extinction. Not through combat, but through systematic adaptation. He showed images of Earth history, humans with primitive weapons bringing down creatures 10 times their size. Humans are tool users par excellence. They don't have claws, so they make knives. They don't have armor, so they invent shields. They don't have venom, so they create chemical weapons. And they are very, very good at learning from failure. You don't become a persistence predator without learning to adapt. The room was silent. During the Sol Unification Wars, a conflict most species know little about, humanity fought itself in the most brutal, innovative warfare in their history. They developed tactics specifically designed to counter their own advantages. By the end, human military doctrine had evolved beyond anything we had seen from a pre-contact species. He looked directly at David. The survivors of those wars, the veterans who saw action, represent perhaps the most battle-tested soldiers of any species currently in the Galactic Academy. Veldar turned back to the class. So when we asked what species is most dangerous, we made assumptions. The Thraka are strong, true. But strength without adaptability is just mass. The Krell have chemical warfare, true. But so do humans, plus antibiotics, plus genetic engineering to counter biological threats. Every advantage we name, humans have encountered and developed countermeasures. He pulled up the vote results again. One person voted for humans. Would you like to guess who? David raised his hand slightly. And his justification was, we don't know when to quit. That is possibly the most accurate assessment of human danger in 4 words or less. Veldar's mandibles clicked in what might have been a smile. Humans are dangerous not because they're the strongest or the fastest or the most venomous. They're dangerous because they're adaptable, persistent, and they absolutely refuse to accept defeat. They are the species that looked at a universe of hostile environments and said, we'll just change our environment instead. He paused, letting that sink in. Which brings us to today's real lesson. David could have told you all of this. He could have demonstrated his capabilities, could have responded to provocations, could have leveraged his military experience to dominate our social hierarchy. Veldar looked at the class. He didn't. Why not? Silence. Trex raised a hand tentatively. Because he didn't want to? Precisely. Because humans value choice. Because after years of violence, he chose peace. Because he came here to learn, not to fight. The professor's eyes swept the room. And we mistook that choice for weakness. Gorath stood slowly. The massive Thraka walked to David's desk, all 4 arms spread in the Thraka gesture of respect. I apologize, he said formally. I tested your boundaries and found them to be self-imposed rather than externally limited. That is wisdom I did not expect. David nodded. Apology accepted. And for what it's worth, you're strong as hell, Gorath. Just maybe don't lead with that in every situation. A ripple of laughter broke the tension. Professor Veldar concluded. So let's revise our understanding. Most dangerous species? It depends on your criteria. But if we're measuring adaptability, persistence, and the sheer stubborn refusal to quit even when quitting would be rational. He pulled up a new slide. Images of humans in spacesuits on colony worlds in research stations throughout the galaxy. Then yes, humans are very, very dangerous indeed. He looked at David. Fortunately for the rest of us, they usually prefer to be scientists. After class, students approached David differently. Not with fear, but with genuine curiosity. They asked about Earth, about human military service, about the wars he'd seen. He answered carefully, honestly, sharing what he could without glorifying violence. Unity of Purpose thanked him again for the rescue. Kreshtar asked if he'd teach her about human tactical thinking. Even Gorath, grudgingly, suggested they train together sometime. David agreed to all of it, because that was the point, wasn't it? He'd left the military, but he hadn't left behind the lessons. About adaptation, about choosing your battles, about knowing when to fight and when to walk away. He'd come to the Galactic Academy to learn about alien life. But in the end, he'd taught the most important lesson. That being dangerous and being peaceful weren't contradictions. They were choices. And humans, as Professor Veldar had noted, were very good at choosing their own path. Even when the rest of the galaxy assumed they couldn't.